Welcome to this video covering the topic of argument mapping from D265 Critical Thinking. In this video we will cover section 4 of the course, lessons 4, 5, and 6. So let's begin with lesson 4. Mapping an argument means drawing a diagram that represents how that argument is supposed to work, how its premises are supposed to lead to its conclusion. The terms you see on the screen right now will become more clear as we see examples of diagramming later in the video. Don't spend too much time right now trying to remember these terms and definitions. Instead, return here once you've completed the rest of the slides and you will find these concepts much easier to think about. With that said, the basic idea is that when arguments become a little longer or more complex, we might not just try to prove our final conclusion, but along the way we'll prove various sub-conclusions that ultimately lead to that final conclusion. So for example, if I say this building has a basement, so the first floor is not its lowest point, and that means we should see stairs or an elevator going down from the first floor. Then my final conclusion is that we should find some stairs or an elevator going down. But along the way to proving that, I proved a sub-conclusion, that the first floor is not the lowest point. So then, my main conclusion was we should see stairs or an elevator going down from the first floor. My sub-conclusion was the first floor is not the lowest point. And that sub-conclusion is also my main premise. It's the statement that most directly supports the main conclusion. My sub-premise was the fact that the building has a basement. This was, so to speak, the premise to my premise. In other words, the statement that supported my main premise. Again, if this seems less than clear at the moment, I recommend moving on and returning to this slide only after you've finished the rest and seen some diagramming in action. This is another pair of terms that will become much more clear as you proceed through the coming slides. Basically, we can say this. Sometimes to prove a point, I give you a bunch of different reasons to believe it, each separately trying to prove the point on its own. That's independent support. But sometimes I give you a bunch of information that's supposed to prove my point only when taken all together. That's conjoint support. So, for example, if I try to prove that some yellow bugs sting by pointing out that bees sting and also that yellow jackets sting, and by claiming that some grasshoppers are yellow and sometimes sting, then I'm giving you 3 separate pieces of evidence for my conclusion. Each one alone is meant to prove the point. The existence of yellow bees by itself proves that some yellow bugs sting. So does the existence of yellow jackets. And so would the existence of stinging yellow grasshoppers if there were such a thing. So each of these propositions was meant to provide independent support for my conclusion, able to stand on its own to prove my point. But if I try to prove that there are some very large cities in the U.S. by pointing out that Chicago is in the U.S. and then also pointing out that Chicago is very large and that there are other cities in the same nation as Chicago that are even larger, then these 3 statements do not independently support my conclusion. Just saying Chicago is in the U.S. doesn't prove that there are some large cities in the U.S. You need to also know that Chicago is very large. And you also need to know that there are other cities in the same nation larger than Chicago. Without all 3 of these pieces of information, you cannot conclude that there are some very large cities in the U.S. The 3 premises need each other. So they are not independent, they are conjoint. If we pretend any of the 3 is false, then we suddenly no longer can draw the conclusion we did. For example, if Chicago isn't in the U.S., then knowing it's very large and that other cities in the same nation are even larger, does not prove that the U.S. has some very large cities in it anymore. Take a look at this example of independent support. Notice that the circle on the bottom of the diagram has the number 1 in it. This means that sentence number 1 is intended to be the main conclusion of the argument. In other words, the argument is trying to prove that Harper is a good friend. Now, look at the 3 premises given for this. Take each one on its own. She sent me a holiday card. That doesn't seem to need any other information to count as evidence that Harper is a good friend. It works on its own. It may not be proof on its own, but it works on its own as evidence. Similarly, she keeps her promises. Again, this works on its own as evidence that she's a good friend without needing any other statement to make that connection. Finally, she treats me with respect. All by itself, treating someone with respect is evidence that you're a good friend to them. The connection between respect and friendship is clear on its own. This is independent support. Now take a look at this example of conjoint support. Once again, we find the conclusion is sentence number 1, bananas are good for you. This argument is meant to prove that bananas are good for you. Let's look at the 2 premises of this argument separately. All fruits are good for you. Does this all by itself give evidence that bananas are good for you? Well, no, because it's not clear what the connection is between fruit being good for you and bananas being good for you. We need more information to make this connection. And that's what the other premise provides, a connection between bananas and fruit. Now that we know that bananas are fruits, we understand why fruit being good for you means bananas are good for you. These 2 premises don't work separately, they work together. Hence, they are examples of conjoint support. Recall that in the first slide, we talked about main conclusions, sub-conclusions, main premises, and sub-premises. Here's where that vocabulary comes in handy. Here we have an example of what is called indirect support. Notice how in the diagram, sentence 3 supports sentence 1, but not by pointing directly at it, but by pointing at sentence 2, which then points at sentence 1. It's cases like this where we have a chain of support that we call indirect support. And using the vocabulary from the first slide, sentence 3 here would be called a sub-premise because it is not directly supporting the conclusion. Meanwhile, sentence 2 would be called the main premise because it does directly support the conclusion. Sentence 1 is the main conclusion, the final conclusion the whole argument is designed to prove. And sentence 2 is a sub-conclusion, not the final conclusion, but a temporary conclusion on the way to the final one. Notice, sentence 2 is both a sub-conclusion and a main premise. This is a pretty normal thing for any argument that is not of the simplest possible type. Now, take a moment to read the actual sentences of the argument. The conclusion is that Bigfoot is real. Directly supporting that, we have the sister seeing Bigfoot. But then we may ask, why should we believe she saw Bigfoot? The answer is in sentence 3. She said so, and she wouldn't lie. So then, the fact that she wouldn't lie supports the idea that she saw Bigfoot. And the fact that she saw Bigfoot supports the idea that Bigfoot exists. Her honesty directly supports her report that she saw him, and her honesty, therefore, indirectly supports the idea that Bigfoot exists. So, putting it all together, here is a more complex argument map, this time without any specific argument provided. We're just looking at the map itself. And it simply illustrates what we've already said about each of the terms we've covered. Sub-premises are premises that lead directly to other premises and not to the main conclusion. Sub-conclusions are statements supported by premises that are not the main conclusion. Main premises do lead directly to the main conclusion. Conjoint support we denote with a single arrow coming from a line under each of the premises involved. And independent support we denote with several individual arrows, each coming directly from the premises involved. Now we'll be covering some concepts from Lesson 5. Sometimes we don't actually express all the conjoint premises in our argument. For example, if I say, this room must have a closet since it's a bedroom, there seems to be an assumption I'm making that I haven't stated out loud. Why should I think that just because it's a bedroom, it must have a closet? It must be that I'm assuming something I didn't say, that all bedrooms have closets. That idea that all bedrooms have closets that I didn't say out loud, but that is needed to make sense of what I did say, we call that a hidden assumption. Here's an example of how to diagram hidden assumptions. Use a dotted circle. Here, in order to build a bridge from cookies are sweets to cookies are bad for you, we need to supply a hidden premise. It must be that this person is assuming that all sweets are bad for you. Finally, from Lesson 6, here is some basic information about how you can use an argument diagram. These diagrams help you clarify how a person's reasoning flows from premise to conclusion, and this in turn helps us think about whether their reasoning is solid, or rests on some bad assumptions, or uses some bad inferences. If we see that all the sub-premises are true, and every arrow represents a solid inference, then we are most likely looking at a good argument. And that concludes this presentation. Thank you for listening.